Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the brazen and shameless hypocrisy of Christian nationalists in the MAGA movement, as Speaker Johnson protects Representative Tony Gonzalez, who ran for Congress on Christian family values, whose affair with a married staffer led her to commit suicide by setting herself on fire, leaving behind a young son. At a time when the President of the United States is accused of raping a 13-year-old girl, which the Department of Justice is covering up, we'll discuss the moral collapse of the GOP with Ann Nelson, an author and lecturer in the fields of international affairs, media, and human rights. She was the director of the international program at the Columbia School of Journalism, where she created the first curriculum in human rights reporting. Her books include Shadow Network, Media Money, and The Secret Hub of the Radical Right, now out in an updated paperback version, and the updated version of the film Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's War and Democracy, based on her book Shadow Network, starts streaming in April, and Anne will be speaking at local screenings. Then Sasha, Linden, Cohen will speak with Heather Ann Thompson, an historian and the Pulitzer Prize and Bancroft Prize-winning author of Blood in the Water, the Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and its Legacy, and Who's Detroit? Politics, Labor, and Race in a Modern American City. She writes regularly on the criminal justice system for a number of publications, and her policy work includes serving on the National Academy of Sciences Blue Ribbon panel that studied the causes and consequences of mass incarceration in the U.S. She also co-runs the Carceral State Research Project at the University of Michigan. Her latest book just out is Fear and Fury, the Reagan 80s, the Bernie Getz shootings, and the rebirth of white rage, which chronicles a crucial turning point in American history when the New York subway shooting of 4 black teens stoked the fear and fury of a stunning number of white Americans, egged on by Rupert Murdoch's New York Post, and later his Fox News network. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is Ann Nelson, an author and lecturer in the fields of international affairs, media, and human rights, who was the director of the international program at the Columbia School of Journalism. Her books include Shadow Network, Media Money, and The Secret Hub of the Radical Right, now out in an updated paperback version. Welcome to Background Briefing, Ann Nelson.
Hey, thank you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Speaker Mike Johnson is a Christian nationalist because in front of his office he has the Christian nationalist flag flying. And a lot of Republican Congress people have been lobbying him to fire this character, Tony Gonzalez, a congressman from Texas, who apparently had an affair with his staffer, a married woman, who apparently he pressured her fairly heavily to engage in this affair. She clearly was troubled by it or even tortured by it to the point where she committed suicide by pouring gasoline over herself and setting herself on fire, leaving behind her husband and a young boy. Now the husband has gone public. He was on CNN last night talking about what a sick person this Representative Tony Gonzalez is. But he's being essentially defended by Mike Johnson. So I find it pretty glaring example of so-called Christian hypocrisy that this guy could not be a worse example of family values. And by the way, Tony Gonzalez ran his campaign to get elected to the House on Christian family values and touted himself as an exemplar of Christian family values. So this keeps happening all the time. This is not a new story, although obviously there are new characters, but the story is an old one. So what is going on in these right-wing Christian circles in terms of all kinds of sexual deviance in spite of them touting Christian family values?
Well, I think it's time for the rest of us to stop letting them claim their brands, because they'll slap the term Christian onto anything, including depriving widows and orphans of their daily meals, and call it Christian. And no Christian theology I've ever encountered endorses that. But beyond that, what we're looking at is a massive kleptocracy where you've got all kinds of theft and grift happening, starting with the Trump and everybody who's working below him, but also something that I've been documenting for a long time in my book, Shadow Network and Elsewhere, which is the sexual perversion of this movement. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I do speculate that a lot of these people come from communities where there's a lot of sexual repression. So when they bust out of that, they do it in ways that leads them into an ethics-free zone. And you only have to take Gonzalez's fellow Texan, Paul Pressler, who was a major figure in founding the MAGA movement, and his decades-long exploitation of a young boy from his Sunday school class. And eventually the young boy grew up and sued him. And this was a scandal that took place in Houston and was of immense embarrassment to this movement. But as I write in my book, it is far from the only case. The whole MAGA movement is riddled with sexual scandal, and Gonzalez is just the latest chapter.
So what's going on with Mike Johnson then? He wears his religion on his sleeve. As I say, he's a Christian nationalist. He sports the Christian nationalist flag in front of the Speaker's office in the House of Representatives. And yet, I mean, I understand the politics of it. They have such a slim majority that they can't afford to have this guy step down. I don't know whether you'd actually end up with the Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries as a speaker, but they're pretty close to that threshold, aren't they? So this is clearly something that Johnson doesn't want to do, and there's a primary going on next week to determine whether or not this guy can represent the same district. And Mike Johnson is basically saying, well, let's let that play out. Let's not have him step down right away.
But again, I think you're absolutely right in talking about this as a political movement. And I think it's high time for us to throw out the term Republican Party, except as it's applied to Adam Kinzinger and a few genuine Republicans with some ethics, and call it the MAGA Party. And I feel the same way about Christian nationalists. I mean, their ties to Christianity get feebler by the moment. And what you have with a figure like Mike Johnson is a scrambling to maintain his narrow edge of power that he has. Now, it's an immensely complicated moment in the House of Representatives, because you have a very, very, paper thin margin in terms of the Republicans' majority. And you have several seats, not just Gonzalez's, that are in play. And then you've got this massively important midterms coming up in November, where the Republicans are widely projected to lose if a legitimate election takes place. So Johnson has always carried water for the MAGA movement. I wrote a piece for the Washington Spectator that's free online, no paywall, that describes how he was actually created by the groups of the Leadership Institute and the Family Research Council, and cultivated and groomed for his current position. He is a creation of the MAGA movement. So it's not any surprise to me that he is maneuvering in Congress to try to maintain their edge on power. That is his job. That is actually his entire identity.
Well, you recall, Anne, recently Trump toured a Ford plant in Michigan, and a worker yelled out to him, "Pedophile protector." And that label could certainly be hurled at Mike Johnson because he has been an active pedophile protector. He has absolutely zealously fought to suppress the Epstein files and to prevent Ro Khanna and Tom Massis from bringing the bill up to the House. So he wouldn't let it go onto the floor. The only way they could work around Mike Johnson, and it took a long time, was to get a discharge petition. He fought that. He fought the seating of a Democratic congresswoman from Arizona for, 30, 60 days? I can't remember how long. So he's just absolutely worked overtime to protect Trump. And on top of that, of course, you have the Department of Justice doing the same thing under Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche. They're working overtime. So let's talk about the pedophile protectors. What is going on with these people? How can this good Christian, Micah Johnson, be protecting a pedophile or a whole bunch of pedophiles, including the President of the United States?
Well, I don't know how much you and your listeners attended Sunday school, but as I recall in the New Testament, Jesus says, don't be showy in your practice of prayer, right? He's like, if you're going to pray, pray in private and engage in charity and Christian love. So again, this showiness, this using Christianity as a political brand is what they do. And their entire political strategy has depended over the years with engaging politically unengaged evangelicals, for the most part, and other conservative Christians to not only register to vote, but to vote for Republicans, and then to whip them up into a frenzy on these issues, such as trans rights and abortion, that have very little to do with their daily lives. And it has the effect of getting them to ignore the issues that do have effects in their daily lives, including inflation and their neighbors who are immigrants and their political and civil rights, as well as their medical care. So that is how they operate. That is the plan. They've carried it out. It's been successful, but it's losing steam. So you can expect them to get more desperate. Now, they've tried really energetically to close down the legitimate sources of journalism that would get this information to the public. So the takeover of CBS is extremely important. The takeover of and the creation of multiple digital platforms is really important. They're going to try to blow this off. And, the falsehoods are kind of stunning. Mike Johnson defended Tony Gonzalez by saying, "Oh, well, we have to find out what the evidence says because George Santos was unfairly accused and not convicted." Well, George Santos was a congressman from New York, a Republican, who fabricated his entire resume and ran for office on a pack of falsehoods. So if that's Mike Johnson's example of somebody who was unfairly accused, that just shows how desperate they are.
But Mike Johnson made a big deal out of having his young daughter pledge her virginity or whatever these fundamentalist Christians do in terms of chastity for their kids and stuff. So he must not want his daughter to be raped by a bunch of rich pedophiles, right? Why is he doing what he's doing, apart from the obvious politics that he's protecting the MAGA leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the pattern that emerges in the Epstein files, the men who are the predators may have daughters, but their daughters aren't the victims. They tend to pick up girls who are of an impressionable age and lower income, right? Who don't have a lawyer as their daddy who's going to fight for them. A lot of times they're from broken homes, single parents. And, you get down to the heart of, or the lack of heart that these people have. Because as long as they and their families have fat bank accounts and a measure of protection, they really don't care what happens to everyone else.
Well, the latest case, though, do you think it could break the dam? The fact that the Department of Justice is clearly holding back files related to a bunch of FBI 302 field reports. They first interviewed a woman on July the 24th of 2019, just after Epstein had been arrested, and she had come forth to tell the FBI that she had been raped by Epstein repeatedly, but she'd also been raped by Trump, who she alleges forced her to give him oral sex. Apparently she didn't want to do it. She bit him. He punched her in the face and said to her, you should be grateful that, you're losing your virginity with me instead of some incompetent 14-year-old boy. So the fact that she was interviewed 4 times by the FBI, so that would indicate that they didn't dismiss her as a crank, because obviously they get all kinds of weird calls, particularly around the time of some prominent person like Epstein is arrested. The fact that they interviewed her 4 times would indicate to me that they took her seriously. These files have been withheld. The file of her accusations against multiple rapes by Epstein when she was babysitting at I think in some Hilton Head, South Carolina, the DOJ released that file, but not these other files involving accusations against Trump himself. And the fact that you and I are talking about this, that the possibility that the President of the United States raped a 13-year-old girl is in itself beyond belief. How did we get to this point? And why isn't the entire country outraged, let alone all of these good Christians?
Well, I think a lot of the country is deeply disturbed by this. Uh, Now, you have 2 issues here. One is this really shocking accusation, although if you look at Donald Trump's behavior in terms of other women and his status as a convicted felon, and his conviction, he was convicted of sex abuse of E. Jean Carroll in New York. So there is a certain pattern here. But the other part of it is the obfuscation on the part of the DOJ. So the Department of Justice is ordered by Congress to release all the files. And the statement that was made was, well, uh, we'll redact, which means to black out certain names and images that are damaging to the victims. Now, what happened in actuality is that information about the victims was not blacked out. It was not redacted in certain cases. And the names of powerful men, wealthy men, and these missing 50 plus pages were omitted. So you have a clear indication that the Department of Justice has not followed the congressional rules and has limited this information as far as it possibly can from the members of Congress who've tried to inspect it. So what this has to suggest, even to people who have supported Trump in the past, is that they think there's something very serious to hide. So I don't, when you talk about the dam breaking, what I see is this picture where, the little boy has his fingers in the dike, and when you remove all the fingers at once, or in succession, the dike doesn't hold. You've got big problems for them on many fronts. You've got inflation continuing, you've got food prices, you've got Trump lying about the cost of gas and innumerable other things in the State of the Union address. You've got people deeply disturbed about ICE and the immigration processes. They're underwater in polls all over the place, and swing voters and young voters and Hispanic voters are turning against Trump in record numbers. So you also have these interim elections in places like Texas and Georgia and Virginia, where you have some counties with 30-point swings towards the Democrats. So again, the fingers are being removed from the dike. And the more the crisis is impending for them, the more desperate measures they will undertake. And what people are concerned about is that ICE is getting a new tranche of armament. There's a talk about, oh, we have a state of emergency, which interestingly enough is going on at the same time with Orban's Hungary. He looks like he's going to lose an election, and all of a sudden he's declaring a state of emergency. And if they militarize the country, they make it harder for a legitimate election to take place.
So what are the possibilities of this woman who brought these charges and this evidence to the FBI back in July of 2019? Presumably she has a lawyer, and at some point or other, could she go public? I mean, the record of women who accused Trump of rape, particularly when they were teenagers, for example, Katie Johnson, and that wasn't her name, but that's the name that was used in the court filings some time back. She accused Trump of rape, and she begged him to stop, and he said, "I can do anything." That was initially entered into court out here in California in Riverside, but then this Katie Johnson disappeared and dropped the case, and her lawyer had said that she'd been threatened with death. So is it possible that we'll either hear from this woman or will she be intimidated, as appears to be the case with Katie Johnson?
Well, my understanding is that the Democrats in the House of Representatives have been in touch with this woman. So they're making public statements based on the verification of her identity. Now, we have seen with, as you say, not just Katie Johnson, but E. Jean Carroll and other accusers, where once they go public with their stories, the MAGA forces make their life hell. And you really don't wish that on anyone, and certainly if it isn't necessary. So I would guess that the Democrats are going to work with this information, and when there's a compelling reason for her to go public and take these risks, that may or may not happen. But I certainly sympathize with women who want to tell their stories, but know that the consequences can be horrific in their own personal lives.
So, Anne, what do you think is happening psychologically with the Trump supporters and the Christian nationalists and the MAGA people in general, where I understand they're propagandized by Fox and they're in a kind of information bubble and they're impervious to facts and information. But nevertheless, there's so much coming out about what a horrible man if Donald Trump is. It's been coming out since 2015. And not only are these horrendous accusations of him raping children coming forth, and they've been coming out and dribbling out for the longest time, the fact that him and his family are just grifting so shamelessly and so brazenly. They've made something like $5 billion out of the presidency. This has never happened before. Anything resembling the grift right across the board. And of course, at the State of the Union on Tuesday night, his behavior was outrageous, demagogic, frightening, I thought. Of course, all fact-free. And yet they're Republicans are jumping up and down like jack-in-the-boxes. When he says brazen things like the Chinese are going to pay for the tariffs and that we're going to substitute tariffs for income tax. I mean, it's just lunacy. So it's beyond fact-free. And yet, these sort of zombie Republicans are just buying it all and reinforcing it all. So I don't understand that mentality. I don't understand how long you can be impervious to facts and still support somebody that is so manifestly corrupt and evil.
Well, I mean, I think I would refer you to the work of my friend and colleague, Stephen Hassan, who's an expert on cults. And he's been describing the Trump movement as a cult for years now. And cults do not, they're not a matter of facts and logic. They're based on people who know how to manipulate emotion. And obviously, Trump is a great master at this. Now, what I see happening in the districts, the electoral districts that I follow closely, is, if I were going to be designing T-shirts for them, they would say two things. One would say, "You've gone too far." So you have examples like, the arrests of little 5-year-old uh, Liam, with his bunny hat, and people say, "No, no, that's not what immigration was supposed to do. They were supposed to go after gangs and hardened criminals, not 5-year-old kids trying to go to kindergarten. You've gone too far," or "they've gone too far." And the second one would be, "We've been betrayed." So you have 15,000 farms that have gone out of business in the first year of this Trump presidency. And those are farmers who voted overwhelmingly for Trump. Trump gets into office. The first thing, not the first thing, but one of the things he does is screw up their international markets for the uh, crops that they've been producing with good faith, knowing that they've had this ongoing market with China and other countries. And this whole tariff regime comes in like wackadoodle and cancels their markets. They have crops rotting in the grain bins. And they're saying, "Wait a minute, you weren't supposed to do this. We were supporting you. You are hurting us. You're actually killing us." And that's where you realize that for Trump, the rest of the citizenry of this country are basically roadkill. So as people start to understand what's happening to them, I think that is having a bigger effect on the electorate than abstract notions like protecting democracy or upholding ethics. I wish it were otherwise, but I don't think it is.
Well, Ann Nelson, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Well, thank you, Ian,
And
and
again,
hope springs eternal.
we could certainly do with some hope here. And I've been speaking with Ann Nelson, who's an author and lecturer in the fields of international affairs, media, and human rights, who was the director of the international program at the Columbia School of Journalism, where she created the first curriculum in human rights reporting. Her books include Shadow Network, Media Money, and The Secret Hub of the Radical Right, now out in an updated paperback version, and the updated version of her film Bad Faith, Christian Nationalism's War on Democracy, based on her book Shadow Network, starts streaming in April, and Ann will be speaking at local screenings. We're going to take a brief station break and we're back with Sasha, Linden, Cohen, speaking with the author of a new book that chronicles the New York subway shooting of 4 black teens that stoked the fear and fury of a stunning number of white Americans, egged on by Rupert Murdoch's New York Post and later his Fox News network.
Well, I don't care if it rains or freezes, as long as I got my classic Jesus riding on the dashboard of my car. Through all trials and tribulations, and my travels through the nations, with my plastic Jesus I'll go far. Oh, plastic Jesus, riding on the dashboard of my car. I'm afraid.
Welcome back. You're listening to Background Briefing. My name is Sasha, Linden, Cohen. A lot of you may remember the infamous 1984 New York City subway shooting when a man named Bernie Goetz gunned down 4 black teenagers on the 2 train. The tabloids, including the New York Post and the New York Daily News, really sensationalized the story. It became a pretty national story, and Goetz was almost immediately cast as a kind of vigilante hero. It was the Reagan era 80s, so it was a time of high crime, a lot of visible poverty, and deep racial anxiety in New York City and across the country. And much of the public applauded him, despite a lot of evidence that the shooting was really unprovoked. So historian Heather Ann Thompson revisits the case in her new book, Fear and Fury, The Reagan 80s, the Bernie Goetz shootings, and the Rebirth of White Rage. She examines not just the shooting, but what the reaction revealed about racial resentment, the consequences of Reaganomics, and the rise of fear-driven politics that we are so familiar with today. The book also centers the 4 teenagers, Daryl Cabey, Barry Allen, Troy Canty, and James Ramser, who have not been written about that much since the shootings until now. So Heather joins us now to talk about the book and share why she thinks this story gives an important framework for understanding modern conservatism and media. Thank you so much for joining us, Heather.
Oh, I'm so glad to be here.
So a lot of people might have strong memories about this incident and a particular narrative about what happened, but in the book you present a very different account. So can you tell me what happened that day on the subway and how it might differ from what people remember? Like, what new information did you find in your research that debunks the prevailing story?
Sure. So this is a moment in 1984, which those of us of a certain age remember pretty clearly because it felt like a real shock in the moment, which was this guy, this white guy, gets on the 2 train in New York City, headed downtown. And on this train are 4 black teenagers who are also headed downtown. In their case, they're from the South Bronx. They are really poor kids who are heading down to a local video arcade to jimmy open the coin receptacles, to potentially get some quarters, to have some measure of income. And in that 5-minute encounter where they sit across from each other, something goes terribly wrong that I think really both changes history, but also reflects the history that this country will become. And that is that they essentially ask, one of them asks this guy, hey, first of all, hey, how you doing? He says, hey, back. And feeling kind of emboldened, he says, do you have $5? And this is the Reagan 80s. This is a grim time. And the kids understood that, panhandling was the way that you got a few extra dollars, especially if you want to go into an arcade and look like you're, have some money to actually play games. And so that wasn't unusual. But what was unusual was that Bernie Getz stands up. He turns around as if he's going to go for his wallet, but he spins around and assumes a combat stance, guns down the teenager that asked him for money, straight in the chest, a bullet, hits the kid behind him, who had not even spoken to this man, in the back as he's trying to flee, shoots one of his friends in the arm that will then go into his lung farther down the train, and then shoots their 4th friend, who is pretty far away from him. Again, none of these other kids have talked to him, and misses. And then he walks over to him and he says, you look okay. Here's another, and shoots him point blank range in his side, which then severs his spinal cord, permanently paralyzing him. But this is not just a crime. This is a crime that is going to really symbolize a new direction that the country was taking, that would be kind of an unleashing and re-legitimization, re-legal sanctioning of acts of vigilante violence that we had not seen since the 19th century.
What you describe is so obviously an unprovoked shooting, sort of a racially motivated act of violence. But I wonder how the impression has changed over time, because I don't think that that's necessarily how everyone understands it, even in retrospect. I think about the Central Park Five, for example, who have a lot of similarities in their case. They were pretty immediately villainized after they were accused of murdering Trisha Meili. But it's also noteworthy that once they were exonerated, public opinion about that case did shift pretty dramatically. I think it's fair to say that their convictions are pretty widely seen as, a grave miscarriage of justice. Like, wow, we really got that one wrong. But it seems like that hasn't happened exactly with the Bernie Getz case. Like, I'll mention that when you were on the Brian Lehrer show recently, there were a lot of calls from listeners saying, well, those kids were going to rob him. They represented a threat. He'd been robbed before. It's complicated.
Yeah.
And these are things that you really disproved in your book. And I wonder why you think it hasn't gotten the same level of retrospective scrutiny.
Well, one thing to remember about the now exonerated 5 is that, well, 2 things. One, that case follows the Bernie Getz case. So actually, if you really want to understand how we could have gotten it so wrong, you have to kind of begin with this, maybe lesser known now case of the Bernie Getz shooting. So that's an interesting connection. But the real point here is that even today, even with them being exonerated, you will find lots of people who say, well, even if they didn't do it, what were they doing there? They must have been doing something, or even outright saying that they were in fact guilty, that they got off on a technicality. In other words, we have taken this turn to just justify a measure of open season, frankly, on Black youth in particular, that it's always been part of our nation's history, but something happens in the 80s where it is getting really ginned up, really curated and reinforced. And that was the story I was interested in telling. And it turns out that that story that we inherited today was one very carefully stoked and crafted by, and this is, I didn't realize, a simultaneously rising, slowly rising conservative misinformation media ecosystem that saw a case like Bernie Goetz's and said, look, this is an amazing opportunity to get market share, to get people, to buy the New York Post, to beat out our competition in the New York Daily News. And meanwhile, all of this is in aid actually of kind of obfuscating what is really happening in the 80s, which is that ordinary people, white and black alike, are suffering this real turn towards privatization, austerity, as you mentioned, and a retreat from the public social safety net that had been so instrumental in this country for decades, building up, an American middle class. And so it's a very complicated story, even while you look at the facts of the case and you think, especially, we walk you through the trial and through, a criminal trial and then a civil trial, you're thinking, how in the world could anybody have celebrated this man, let alone vindicated him in a court of law? But in there lies so many interesting connections to today and reasons for us to look at episodes today with a degree of skepticism and, frankly, a degree of caution as we move forward to believe, some of the generating of hatred that we're being served up now, the anti-immigrant stuff, the anti-woke stuff, the anti-anything stuff. There's a clear agenda behind it.
Absolutely. I want to get into Reaganomics and sort of the misunderstanding of that. But I first want to address the sort of media component that you talked about. It's a huge character in the book, you could say. Rupert Murdoch had just acquired the Post. There was a very, if it bleeds, it leads kind of ethos that we still see in the Post today. And we saw kind of the advent of the conservative media machines, as you describe it. And I wonder how you see this particular incident as sort of an origin story for what the sort of politics of fear that we see today and kind of understand as just a natural part of the media ecosystem. Why this case as an origin story for that?
Well, imagine this is a moment in the 80s, as we began talking about in the top of the program, that you have literally people being fearful all the time. This is a city, the crime rate is high, people are losing their jobs, the drug economy is expanding because there are no other kinds of jobs for people to have. Drug addiction is rising, public services are shrinking, public schools are suffering, libraries are shuttering their doors. And so it is a moment of civic crisis, civic abandonment. And so when you have somebody who is walking out their door every day, like Bernie Goetz, who sees the trash and he sees the lack of city services, and then if you're in the South Bronx, like these four teenagers, and you have no jobs and your schools are falling apart, there has to be a language to make people understand that, or else they're going to say, look, politicians, what's going on? We need more social services. We need more resources. And instead, what people said was, well, I guess all this crime is happening because of those no good kids in places like the South Bronx. I guess the reason why I can't get a job is because somebody is taking my job less qualified than me. I guess the trash isn't getting picked up because, drug addicts are, subhuman who don't know how to keep themselves clean. I mean, literally all of this rhetoric is being served up in a really new way via the tabloid media. And why? You might say, well, what's the point? Why do they want to do that? Well, because, of course, this is a moment when it isn't just that the Reagan Republicans want to change governance in America, cut taxes for the wealthy, all of that. So do the people running this particular conservative tabloid, the New York Post, the Rupert Murdoch folks. And they understand this is an opportunity. It's going to allow them to dominate the U.S. media market. It's going to allow them. Actually, Reagan understands that Rupert Murdoch is his right-hand man in this mission to translate what's happening in a way that will not come back at them. And frankly, it's a brilliant strategy because unlike lots of other decades when rich folks had wanted to undo the New Deal, had wanted to roll back the public sector, they pull it off. And they pull it off through a lot of effort. I think that's really what my book shows. It takes a lot of curation of that resentment and the rage. And so then what does that mean? It means that by the time Bernie gets on that train and this thing kind of blows up, right? All of a sudden someone's actually acting on that rage. They're actually shooting down 4 kids. There's this key moment. Well, what are we going to do about that? Are we going to censor it? Are we going to say, well, everybody needs to be more civilized? Or are we going to unleash it? Are we going to say, damn straight, we admire this guy. This guy he's like Charles Bronson. He's the death wish vigilante. He does what we all wish we had the guts to do, gun down these thugs and these criminals. And they opt for the latter. And that strategy will be a winning strategy. They will invest in it. They would, at some point, they have like 8 editions of the New York Post with new headlines, getting people invested in this understanding of what's happened to their city. And not unimportantly, that strategy will soon start to shape mainstream media, right? Doing a lot more crime coverage without context. And for Rupert Murdoch in particular, it will allow him to then take that print media way of changing hearts and minds in this country into a cable news version of it. And that's going to change the future in no small part because people like Donald Trump understood the power of media to change hearts and minds and to amass even greater wealth, frankly.
Mm. It's so interesting to think about this in the backdrop of New York. I mean, obviously there was a lot of crime. It was really dangerous. There was the AIDS crisis. It was a rough place to live. Um, those conditions, as you say, weren't really being traced back to the austere fiscal policies under Reagan. There wasn't this strong link in the public consciousness between Reaganomics and these conditions. And I wonder, given the fact that New York was largely Democratic, there was a liberal mayor, why wasn't Reagan more of an obvious target of blame? It seems like people really held individuals responsible instead, but I wonder, in the Democratic Party, how did they miss that? Or was it a willingness to miss that? I mean, obviously, we see Bill Clinton a few years later adopt these kind of tough on crime policies that have been since criticized a lot, but it didn't seem like the Democrats or the more progressive leadership in New York City was all that in opposition to this New York Post narrative.
I mean, one of the tragedies, I think, of this story is that the turn that this nation takes circa 1980 is so profound, so comprehensive in its um, uh, mission and in the crafting of the cultural buy-in to it, that eventually it is across the party spectrum. I mean, both Democrats and Republicans are agreeing that taxes shouldn't be high and agreeing that the private sector might be a good place to turn to provide services to people over the public sector, or that, it's okay for people to choose private schools over public schools as if it's an even playing field. And that's the tragedy of this story, that when this is all going on, unfortunately, there is little pushback. And frankly, even the Black middle class is buying in, not 100%. They are very critical of Bernie Getz by and large, but they too start to buy into this notion that some people are just, they're the underclass. They are just they are just completely dependent on welfare. They are lazy. They are criminalistic. So there's a way in which this is such an effective strategy that pretty soon anybody with means anybody with some comfort in their life and some job security and some sense of economic stability, rather than look at everybody else left behind and say, what's wrong with this society that it would leave so many people behind, says there must be something wrong with all of those people that they got left behind. And that's a profound shift from what came before, which, without belaboring it, let me just say, after the 1930s, after the Great Depression, there was this understanding, again, across parties, even though, to different degrees, that look, everybody is going to need a little bit of a hands up. Everybody is going to need, access to public schools, their food protected from the FDA, the ability to retire when you are too old to work, the ability to get resources if you're disabled and can't work. And that ethos governed for a very long time too. But that was what the Reagan Republicans were trying to undo, because that required rich people to pay a high tax rate into the public good, which, by the way, is true of all successful Western democracies with a welfare state, right?
Mm.
Taxes are high, but the payoff is so high, which is that you have a robust, safer, more financially secure nation. The fact that they were able to do this in this moment is interesting. I tell you about that in the book. It isn't just that they're able to curate it. They see an opportunity at the close of the 1970s to step in and start to really use a financial crisis that was global, that would have passed, as an excuse to say liberal governance is a failure. We need to take a different turn. And all of that is in this story, but I hope, anyway, you will tell me, but I hope that I do that story in such a way that we're not just hammering, fiscal ideas and tax policy, but actually telling you how this plays out on the ground in a real life, quite dramatic event on a subway train that will then take two grand juries, that it has a manhunt and a criminal trial and a civil trial. And through that narrative, I hope we can then see kind of how we ended up here, even if we didn't know what was happening, frankly.
Absolutely. There's something very immediate about the conditions of the streets, like what you walk outside and see, what Bernie Getz walked outside every day and saw, drug use and AIDS and violence is such a palpable thing that you can kind of moralize, and connecting that to some sort of abstract policy, abstract thing that's coming from way up above, it's harder to weaponize.
But
Yeah.
that was the beauty of it, right? The beauty of it was that what was in fact going on was a systematic disinvestment in the lives of this nation's most marginalized people, but also in the lives of the American middle class. So
Hmm.
things like financial aid for college, or the ability to get mortgages on houses, or the ability to have good, stable public housing until you could get enough money to buy a house. Like, all of
Hmm.
these things get eroded. And it is that erosion that is very traumatic, very immediate, as you say. You walk out of your door and you can see homeless people everywhere. You don't know why, but it's unsettling. You see drug addicts without clinics to go to, but your focus is not on they have no clinics to go to. Your focus is on, why are there so many people addicted on my streets? I mean, I think a lot today, for example, in places like Philadelphia, right? There is a terrible problem with opioids, and they're, across like Kensington and places like that. It's very hard for people to say, why is this happening in Kensington? It is very easy to say, my God, these people are zombies. What's wrong with them? Why aren't they getting clean? Why aren't they going to rehab? But if you were to dig into the history of a place like Kensington, you quickly understand that Kensington used to be a viable working class part of Philadelphia that was systematically eroded starting in the 1980s. And then what was left was wreckage. But we don't understand the wreckage that we are left with. Instead, we are offered something which is called resentment, rage, and now the legal right to act on that resentment and rage. And at the end of the day, I think what the recent election in New York has shown is it actually is wearing a little thin. Your resentment, your rage, your right to gun people down is still not putting food on the table or helping you to send your kids to college, to educate them. It doesn't give you health care. And so I find this story so interesting because it's about the past, but it's also very much about the instability of the present and the hope, frankly, for how we can maybe return to a more just civic understanding of governance.
I want to ask specifically about Jimmy Breslin, who was a columnist for the Daily News. He's a really interesting character in this story because he was at first one of the only journalists really pushing back against this vigilante hero narrative about Getz, and was pretty defensive of the teams, and he got a lot of criticism for it. But then he ended up actually sneaking into the hospital to interview one of the teenagers, Daryl KB, when he'd just come out of a coma. He published that interview, and it painted the boys in a really bad light, ended up playing a important role in the case against Bernie Getz and sort of undermining that case. Can you walk me through a little bit about who Jimmy Breslin is, why his role in this was so important, and why he changed in such a dramatic way?
Jimmy Breslin is such an interesting and, powerful figure in New York history in general. Any New Yorker will remember Jimmy Breslin's audacious journalistic style, writing for the New York Daily News. And really, he was cut from that New Deal cloth of, New Deal liberal cloth of trying to understand the social circumstances behind stories, the economic underpinnings of stories. And so I love talking about his role in this because you can almost see he represents the America that is kind of being beaten up to be a different kind of America. He starts off, as you say, he wants to tell the story of these teenagers. He pushes back against all efforts to criminalize them when they didn't deserve it and to lie about what they were doing on the train that day. And yet he's working for a paper that is also fighting for its life for media market share with the New York Post. He is getting tremendous pushback from readers who are, again, being stoked, curated to be outraged and rage filled. And I don't quite know, but I think that there was a sense even in him of dubiousness the longer this went on. And we are all susceptible to believing stories that we hear and see as potentially true. And I'm sure, even though I was never, of course, able to ask him this, I'm quite sure that his own press was pushing him to continue to follow up on the story of this shooting, which meant if you could somehow get a hold of Shirley Caby, Daryl's mother, and get in that hospital room and get an interview, then you have an obligation to do that. And, did he say in that piece that, did he acknowledge that Daryl fell asleep during the interview, that he wasn't exactly coherent? Yeah, he did all that. He did his due diligence, but he also repeated something that probably caused much more harm than good because it was coming from someone that was brain damaged and didn't really even understand the context of the interview. So he's kind of a tragic figure. He represents that moment when the journalists are trying to do their job, but the media ecosystem is becoming almost untenable
Hmm.
to tell the truth.
You've talked in interviews before about your decision not to interview Bernie Getz for this book, even though he's still alive and giving interviews, and he's kind of built his name for himself as a conservative political pundit. And you made that decision because you wouldn't have been able to give the same airspace to the victims. One of them took his own life. One of them is, severely disabled. The other two didn't want to talk. I'm not exactly sure.
Yeah, there's only two living, and one is brain damaged and disabled, and the other managed to finally rebuild his life and is so
Mhm.
dubious of talking to people, he needs to be left in peace, frankly.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was curious about your contact or relationships to the victims or their families at all if you as you're writing this book. I mean, it doesn't seem like it was totally necessary to build out this narrative to have those relationships, but do you know at all what they think of your work? Because it does seem like this is one of the first real thorough retellings of this thing that so many people remember?
Yeah, I don't know. And in part, that's again because the wreckage of this story is, what happened to these families. But at the same time, there's a truly heroic story told about these families. Daryl Caby's mother, Shirley Caby, to me is the real heroine of this story. Of course, she's no longer alive. So, I'm not able to. I was not able to talk to so many of the players in this story, but in part, as we just discussed, it was in part deliberate because I felt really strongly that there'd been so much noise around this case and there'd been so much media around this case and there'd been so many competing narratives about this case that what we needed to do was just to go back to the beginning, to actually look at things like the ballistics report and actually to go back and actually look at the diagrams of the train and actually go back and look at the medical reports of these teenagers and go back and look at what Bernie Goetz himself was actually saying and doing at the time and reconstruct the story. And in doing that, that's how the story of the boys got resurrected, because they are, of course, the story, right? They are the ones who paid the highest price for this ultimate rage. And when you talk to people in the present, it is the story they remember. It's not necessarily the story that was.
Absolutely. So before I let you go, I wanted to just ask if you have any quick last words for our listeners about why they need to get a hold of your new book.
Well, first of all, I am so happy to participate because I love supporting radio. And I think that my encouraging words would be read this story, whether or not you're interested in it because it has its own true crime elements, or whether you're interested because it'll tell you something about Trump or Giuliani or Rupert Murdoch or Fox News, or read it because you just want to know what happened back in '84 to these four teenagers. But at the end of the day, I think you will come away with it feeling, that the thing about today is that the future is yet to be decided, because so much of what was built over the last 50 years was unstable. And that's why it required so much curation to make it stick. And I feel like we're in an exciting moment moving forward, actually. And to understand the past will really help us to move forward, I think, in a better direction than we have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Heather.
Thank you for having me on.
And again, we've been speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Heather Ann Thompson. Her latest book is Fear and Fury: The Reagan 80s, the Bernie Goetz shootings, and the Rebirth of White Rage.
And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
Playing One more light goes out.